Somewhere around 1917, those working at Winfield Hall had grown used to an unusual sight. Their employer, counted among America's wealthiest men, could often be found strolling through the marble hallways dressed in a military uniform that once belonged to Napoleon, a bicorn hat resting on his head and gold epaulets adorning his shoulders. He occupied the very bed that had belonged to the French emperor, would spend hours seated upon a throne upholstered in red velvet, and maintained a personal library filled with texts on Egyptian mythology and esoteric rituals. His name was Frank Winfield Woolworth. He had erected the tallest structure on Earth and operated the most extensive network of stores globally, all peddling merchandise priced at no more than 10 cents. At the opposite end of his mansion, with the door kept shut, his wife occupied a sparsely furnished room containing just a single bed and a rocking chair. Her mental faculties had abandoned her more than a year prior. A nurse remained stationed just outside. Woolworth seldom made the journey to see her. He had launched his empire with $300 borrowed capital, opening a store that lasted merely a fortnight before failing. He concluded his journey with a residence of marble, an obsession with Napoleon, and a household destined for destruction at the hands of his own fortune. Chapter 1. Potatoes and Pennies. The agricultural property sat 11 miles south of Watertown in Jefferson County, New York. It was hardly a thriving concern. The earth in Rodman produced potatoes and precious little besides, while mortgage payments arrived with greater dependability than the seasonal harvests. John Hubble Woolworth had come back from the Civil War and wed Fanny MacBreer during 1851. Their eldest son, Frank Winfield, entered the world on April 13, 1852. A subsequent boy, Charles Sumner, followed 4 years later. The younger child's name carried deliberate meaning. Charles Sumner represented the Massachusetts senator and committed abolitionist, and the Woolworths, being devout Methodists who had backed the Union cause, selected it intentionally. The boys were required to contribute to the household. Dawn brought milking duties preceding school. Evening demanded potato picking by hand until darkness fell. Frank despised each moment of this existence. Though he performed adequately as a student and found favor with his teachers, nobody in Rodman anticipated him becoming anything beyond a farmer. The prevailing belief held that he and his brother would eventually succeed their father, just as their father had succeeded his own. Yet Frank harbored alternative aspirations. At merely 4 years of age, he declared to his parents his desire to become a traveling peddler like those salesmen who occasionally made their way through the county. He and Charles passed their leisure hours pretending to operate a shop. Frank would set out goods upon a makeshift counter and conduct transactions with his younger brother, negotiating costs with such gravity that the watching adults found themselves both amused and perplexed. The family residence sat near the remnants of an estate once associated with Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's elder brother, who had passed years in American exile following his deposition as King of Spain. Based on accounts emerging later in Frank's life, the boys found themselves captivated by the narratives connected to that location. Tales of far-off empires, conquered territories, and a military commander who had compelled all of Europe to submit to his authority. For a youth trapped extracting potatoes from cold earth, Bonaparte symbolized everything Rodman failed to offer. Frank departed from formal education at 16 and began laboring on the farm without respite. His mother Fanny perceived his discontent and stepped in. She financed her son's attendance at a bookkeeping program offered by a business institution in Watertown, drawing funds from her own relatives. Following each day's agricultural labor, Frank would drive the family pony and cart into town for evening instruction. He absorbed commercial principles, yet he examined the shop windows with even greater attention. The storefronts lining Watertown's principal streets planted something within him that classroom instruction merely strengthened. He imagined becoming a locomotive engineer. He observed trains moving through Watertown and envisioned an existence defined by motion and faraway places, but he ultimately reasoned himself away from it. A merchant, he ultimately determined, offered a more achievable path. He started examining every retail establishment he encountered with the perspective of someone intending to own one. Then arrived the incident he would continue describing decades afterward as foundational. Frank together with his brother Charles gathered 50 cents in accumulated coins to purchase their mother a birthday gift. Entering a Watertown department store, they discovered a silk scarf. When they presented their coins at the counter, the salespeople gathered round to mock them. The boys faced ridicule for offering payment in nickels and pennies. One clerk sneered that perhaps the following year they might gather sufficient funds for the coordinating gloves. Frank departed. He located a comparable scarf at an alternative establishment where the employees behaved courteously, yet the humiliation remained with him. Walking home alongside his brother, he uttered a statement that, considering what followed, resembles less a juvenile boast and more a pronouncement of warfare. He informed Charles that someday 50 cents would purchase 5 or perhaps 10 items, and every customer, irrespective of payment method, would receive dignified treatment. Another decade would pass before he acted upon this conviction. Yet the youth from the potato farm had discovered something more potent than ambition. He had uncovered a source of resentment. And Frank Woolworth was not the sort of individual who permitted resentment to fade. During spring 1873, Fanny convinced her husband to free Frank from farm duties for 6 months. Permit him to attempt, she argued. Let him discover whether he can achieve something of himself in town. John agreed, though reluctantly. Frank gathered his possessions and departed for Watertown. He was 20 years old. He possessed no connections, no practical experience, and no particular aptitude for merchandising. What he carried was a grudge the size of Jefferson County. This would prove entirely sufficient. Chapter 2. The Worst Salesman in Watertown. Frank walked into the Augsbury and Moore dry goods establishment during spring 1873 carrying a bookkeeping certificate and a proposition. He would labor without compensation for 3 months, accepting no wages in exchange for learning the trade. Morgan Augsbury, the senior partner, examined him and perceived an unsophisticated country youth lacking proper neckwear or counter manners. He felt no interest, yet William Moore, the junior partner, appreciated the boldness of the proposal and consented to take a chance. Should Frank demonstrate usefulness by the 4th month, a modest salary would follow. He failed to demonstrate usefulness, at least not in the manner anyone anticipated. They assigned him to floor sweeping, package delivery, and shelf restocking. When finally permitted to assist customers, the results proved agonizing. He became paralyzed. His sales pitch faltered awkwardly. The staff began viewing him as a liability, and Augsbury privately questioned whether Moore had erred. Yet Frank possessed one capability that nobody else behind the counter could equal. He could arrange an appealing window display. Given responsibility for the front presentation, he organized merchandise by color and form, stacking items at angles designed to capture attention. The storefront became something that drew individuals off the sidewalk and through the entrance. Augsbury observed this, Moore observed this, and customers observed this. Within months, window dressing became Frank's regular assignment. It was while observing those customers that an insight began developing. The customary practice in dry goods establishments at that time required a clerk to position himself between the merchandise and the purchaser. A customer would explain what they wanted. The clerk would retrieve it, quote a price, and bargaining would ensue. Nothing carried a fixed ticket. Nothing sat within reaching distance. The entire system relied upon the person positioned behind the counter. Frank, who performed terribly in that role, started recognizing the imperfection. What if merchandise was positioned where people could handle it? What if every article displayed its price already attached? What if the presentation accomplished the selling while the clerk merely processed the payment? He could not have articulated it in those precise terms, yet the seed had been planted. He remained at Moore's establishment for 6 years. His wages gradually increased to $10 weekly, were reduced to 8 following a difficult period, and drove him to such exhaustion at one point that he physically collapsed and spent 6 months recuperating at home. He was not suited for the daily retail grind as it then existed. Yet he was constructing a different concept within his mind, one that would eventually supplant the old system entirely. Jenny Kitten entered his life somewhere during those intervening years. She had been born in Picton, a modest community in Ontario, Canada, and worked as a seamstress in the same establishment. Where Frank exhibited restlessness and volatility, Jenny demonstrated steadiness. Where he envisioned things in expansive, impractical terms, she concerned herself with what was real and necessary. They wed on June 11, 1876, in what by all accounts represented a genuine love match. Jenny would later confide to friends that the earliest years proved finest, not because of material possessions, but because of how much of Frank she retained. When no empire required running, he came home each evening. When no fortune demanded management, they sat together. She once remarked that she had experienced greater happiness when they possessed virtually nothing. By the time anyone thought to document it, she could no longer express much of anything. Frank's concluding education at Moore's came from a clearance sale of surplus merchandise. Leftover inventory was piled onto a table and marked at 5 cents per piece. The items moved rapidly. Customers who would never have examined them behind glass casing grabbed them eagerly when the price stood visible and goods lay within reach. Various accounts attribute the concept's origin to different individuals. One version mentions a traveling salesman describing 5-cent counters operating in Michigan. Another suggests Frank overheard Moore discussing the concept with a competitor. A third proposes he simply observed it himself and reached his own conclusions. The origin mattered less than the validation. The 5-cent table proved what his display window had already indicated. People would purchase nearly anything if the price was transparent, access was straightforward, and the experience failed to make them feel diminished. He now possessed the concept. He merely needed someone to provide the necessary funds. Chapter 3. $300 and a bad address. William Moore extended him $300 worth of merchandise. Not currency, but inventory, thimbles, combs, button hooks, harmonicas, infant bibs, soap, pencils, and napkins. The sort of minor articles occupying the rear shelves of every dry goods operation throughout the Northeast. Moore additionally released Frank from his responsibilities at the shop so he could search for suitable premises. He selected Utica, New York. On February 22, 1879, Frank opened the doors of Woolworth's great 5-cent store on Bleecker Street. The space measured approximately 13 feet by 20. Everything within was priced at a nickel. The initial days showed promise. Customers entered, picked up items, examined them, and made purchases. The novelty of entering a place where every price was predetermined and no negotiation required drew people through the entrance. Yet the novelty diminished. The location proved poor. Foot traffic decreased. And within several weeks, the enterprise had concluded. Frank repaid what he owed, packed up the signage, and departed. He did not, however, pack up the concept. What failed in Utica was the situation, not the principle. Frank remained convinced of this. An acquaintance suggested Lancaster, Pennsylvania, situated deep within Pennsylvania Dutch territory, where thriftiness represented a cultural value and a 5-cent bargain might be received differently. Frank transported the identical sign across state boundaries and reopened on June 21, 1879 on North Queen Street. First-day receipts reached $127.65. By the standards of a single-person enterprise selling nickel merchandise, this proved remarkable. Within weeks, Frank made a determination that would shape his entire subsequent career. He introduced a second merchandise tier priced at 10 cents. The expanded selection meant he could stock items possessing genuine household utility, not merely novelties and trifles. Customers who entered seeking a 5-cent comb departed with a 10-cent set of napkins. The typical transaction amount doubled. Lancaster held steady. The store generated profit. Frank brought in his brother Charles to manage a second location in Harrisburg. That one encountered difficulties with a problematic landlord and eventually closed. A third attempt in York, Pennsylvania lasted merely months before similarly folding. The pattern proved brutal. For every location that endured, another failed. Frank developed ability to evaluate a town quickly, to identify pedestrian traffic patterns, to recognize the distinction between a main thoroughfare and a side street merely resembling one. What he additionally learned was that he could not accomplish this alone. Each fresh location demanded a manager. And Frank discovered that optimal managers were individuals possessing personal stake in the outcome. He started recruiting partners from among those he already knew. Former colleagues from Moore's establishment, family members who understood the work, men willing to invest their own savings alongside his merchandise and divide the proceeds. Every new opening represented a small partnership, and every successful partner became a node within an expanding network. By 1889, a decade following the Utica failure, Frank Woolworth operated 12 profitable locations across Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. His sales had grown by 240%. By 1900, the chain had expanded to 59 outlets generating annual revenue surpassing $5 million, a sum equivalent to roughly $155 million in today's currency. The red storefront had become recognizable. The 5 and 10 cent format had demonstrated its viability in small towns and medium-sized cities equally. And Frank, the the young man who could not sell fabric to preserve his career, had constructed something no individual salesman could have matched, a system, a mechanism that moved merchandise by eliminating every obstacle separating product from customer. Yet he continued purchasing through wholesalers, continued paying intermediaries, and continued watching profit margins shrink on his most popular merchandise categories. The subsequent step would demand a different form of ambition. Not additional locations, but greater control. Chapter 4. The Syndicate. The relocation to Brooklyn occurred in 1886. Frank required proximity to the wholesale suppliers concentrated near New York's commercial waterfront, and he needed a central office from which to direct what had become too extensive for one individual to manage through correspondence and rail travel. He rented space on Chamber Street in Lower Manhattan and commenced sending daily communications to every manager throughout the chain. The letters were thorough, specific, and unrelenting. Which items were selling, which were not, how displays should appear, how counters should be arranged. He prescribed each location's layout, down to merchandise placement on individual tables, and he anticipated compliance. Managers performing well received commendation and bonuses. Those who did not received a personal visit from Frank himself, who had developed the practice of entering his own outlets unexpectedly and pocketing merchandise to determine whether staff noticed. Those who detected him sometimes received rewards. Those who did not receive conversations they preferred not to repeat. Yet the genuine breakthrough during those initial Chamber Street years was not organizational. It concerned supply. Frank had been purchasing through wholesalers, paying their markup, and observing his margins compress as the chain expanded. When he decided to stock candy, he bypassed intermediaries entirely and acquired directly from producers. The savings proved immediate and substantial. The producers, in turn, proved willing to reduce prices for a buyer who could guarantee volume across dozens of locations. Frank applied the identical approach to additional product categories and within several years was sourcing goods from factories across the United States and Europe, often acquiring entire production runs at negotiated rates. This represented the transformation that converted the 5 and 10-cent store from an innovative retail concept into an industrial enterprise. Volume purchasing granted Frank leverage no individual shopkeeper could equal, and it attracted attention from the men he had trained. The partner managers who had opened locations on Frank's behalf during the 1880s had absorbed his methods thoroughly. Several had grown ambitious enough to venture independently, launching separate chains utilizing the identical format, identical pricing, and identical visual presentation. Rather than oppose them, Frank did something counterintuitive. He coordinated them. The arrangement became known as the Friendly Rival Syndicate. Each chain operated under its founder's name, established its own strategy, and competed with others for territory, yet they combined their purchasing power through Frank's procurement office, exchanged information about successful merchandise, and carried largely identical stock. The rivals appeared similar from the exterior, the red facades, the open counters, the fixed prices. Inside, they remained separate enterprises operated by individuals who owed their start to the same Watertown dry goods establishment. The key figures were Frank's own people. His cousin Seymour Horace Knox had constructed a chain exceeding 100 outlets. Fred Morgan Kirby, who had partnered with Charles Woolworth on a successful operation in Wilkes-Barre back in 1884, controlled 84 more. Earl Perry Charlton operated 48, concentrated in Canada and Western states, and Charles Woolworth himself, Frank's quieter brother, managed 14. Frank's chain, the largest, operated 319. The family network extended beyond the founders. Jenny's sister, Mary Rattone, became reportedly the first woman to manage a Woolworth outlet, overseeing the Poughkeepsie branch before being promoted to manage a flagship location in New York City. Jenny's brothers managed branches in Connecticut. The operation was a family enterprise in the most literal sense, and loyalty was both anticipated and rewarded. When Frank eventually took the company public, he granted William Moore, the men who had advanced him that initial $300 in stock, a payment of $500,000 in appreciation. By 1900, the syndicate collectively dominated the American market for low-priced merchandise. Yet the structure harbored a vulnerability. 5 independent chains meant 5 separate corporate entities, each susceptible to acquisition by outsiders. In 1905, Frank incorporated his own chain as F.W. Woolworth & Company, selling shares to trusted managers and family members. This represented a defensive measure. In correspondence to his managers, he wrote with apparent reluctance that contemporary methods must be pursued. The other syndicate members followed, incorporating their own chains over subsequent years. The concluding step came on November 12, 1911. Frank persuaded all four rivals to consolidate their operations into a single corporation bearing the Woolworth name. The arrangement brought 596 locations under unified control with $65 million in combined capital. Frank became president. Knox, Kirby, Charlton, and Charles each assumed vice president positions. This represented at the time the largest retail consolidation in American history. The farm youth from Rodman now controlled a commercial empire extending from the Atlantic seaboard to the Rocky Mountains. He had accomplished this without any bank loans, without any shares sold to the public, and without ever learning to sell a customer a yard of fabric. He had, however, learned to construct something that performed the selling for him. And he was about to demonstrate this in steel and stone. Chapter 5. The Cathedral of Commerce. In 1910, Frank Woolworth began quietly acquiring properties along Broadway and Barclay Street in Lower Manhattan. He employed a real estate agent named Edward Hogan to manage the purchases, and he informed nobody outside his immediate circle about his intentions. By April, he owned the entire block. The site faced City Hall Park, one of the few open spaces in Lower Manhattan where a tall structure could be viewed from a distance rather than being obscured by surrounding buildings. His original concept was modest by the standards of what ultimately emerged. A commercial office building, 12 to 16 stories, sufficiently large to accommodate Woolworth Company headquarters and produce rental income from tenants. Yet modesty failed to persist. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower had recently risen to 700 feet on Madison Square, claiming the title of the world's tallest structure. Frank examined it and then examined his architect's renderings, and the figures started climbing. He had engaged Cass Gilbert, a Minnesota-born architect educated at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who had worked for the prestigious New York firm of McKim, Mead, and White before establishing his own practice. Gilbert had earned national recognition designing civic structures, including the Minnesota State Capitol. He understood how to make a building feel significant. Woolworth dispatched him to London to study the Houses of Parliament and the Victoria Tower with instructions to bring back something carrying equivalent weight. Gilbert delivered. His design grew from 20 stories to 40, then higher. By the time Woolworth finished pushing, the plans called for 60 stories reaching 792 feet. Every vertical line in the facade would draw the eye upward. The exterior would be clad in cream-colored architectural terracotta with Gothic ornaments scaled sufficiently large to read from street level. Finials, arches, and gargoyles would reference medieval European cathedrals. The building would appear to belong to an older, grander civilization, while its framework remained pure 20th century engineering. That framework required 69 pneumatic caissons driven 100 to 120 feet through Manhattan clay and sand to reach solid bedrock. The steel frame ascended rapidly. Workers completed the structure on July 1, 1912, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Frank observed every construction phase and involved himself in details most clients left to architects. He insisted upon the finest specification materials. He wanted marble in the lobby, mosaics on the vaulted ceilings, and stained glass filtering light from above. Then he wanted it taller. Then he wanted it taller still. The cost escalated from an initial estimate of $5 million to a final figure of $13.5 million. Goldman Sachs declined to finance the project. Frank paid for everything personally. Cash. No mortgage, no bonds, no outside investors possessing leverage over the design. It was his building, and he intended it to serve as the largest advertisement on earth. Every individual viewing the New York skyline would see his name. He was also determined to generate profit. Frank marketed the office space personally, charging a minimum of $4 per square foot and emphasizing the building's safety features. He arranged a demonstration for concerned tenants. A raw egg was placed in one of the elevators 700 feet up. The cable was severed. The pneumatic brakes engaged, and the car glided to a stop without cracking the shell. Tenants signed leases. Within weeks of opening, the building was producing income. The grand opening took place on April 24, 1913. President Woodrow Wilson, seated in the White House, pressed a telegraph button at the appointed hour. 80,000 incandescent bulbs illuminated simultaneously, lighting the tower from base to crown. The effect, viewed from across the East River and from vessels in the harbor, was described by Scientific American as a great crystal of flaming light. The Reverend S. Parks Cadman, standing in the lobby, looked up at the barrel-vaulted ceiling with its Byzantine mosaics and declared it the Cathedral of Commerce. Gilbert had placed sculpted caricatures on the ceiling beams of the entrance hall. One showed Frank Woolworth hunched over a pile of coins counting his nickels. Another showed Gilbert himself cradling a small model of the building in his arms. Frank reportedly considered these his favorite features in the entire structure. The man who had been mocked for paying in loose change now presided over the highest occupied point on Earth, and he had financed it the same way, coin by coin. The tower retained its title for 16 years. In 1929, the nearby tower at 40 Wall Street edged past it, and the Chrysler Building followed within months. Yet by then, the Woolworth Building had already secured something that raw height could not guarantee. It had become a landmark. Not because it was tall, but because Cass Gilbert and Frank Woolworth had given it a countenance people remembered. The Gothic spire above Broadway became a fixed point in the city's identity, as enduring as the bridges and the park below. Frank called his private office inside the tower his imperial capital. The word selection was not coincidental. The nickels and dimes had constructed an empire, and now they had constructed its throne room. He sat higher above ground than any other private citizen on the planet, directing a chain exceeding 1,000 locations from a desk surrounded by marble and gold leaf. Yet the view from the top floor did not extend to the rooms of his own household, where matters were beginning to unravel. Chapter 6. The Daughters and the Death at the Plaza. By 1910, Frank Woolworth had organized his family like a window display. He owned his own mansion on Fifth Avenue at 80th Street opposite the Metropolitan Museum, and he had purchased townhouses for each of his 3 daughters on the same block. Helena resided next door. Edna was 2 houses away. Jessie was around the corner. It appeared like a family possessing everything, including proximity. In practice, it represented a row of expensive containers occupied by women who rarely encountered their father and could not reach him when they did. Helena, the eldest, had been born in 1878. She wed Charles Edward McCann, a former assistant district attorney, in 1904. It was a respectable match. McCann came from money, but not controversy, and Helena settled into a life of philanthropy and quiet stability on Long Island. She bore 3 children, avoided press attention, and utilized her inheritance wisely. Among the 3 Woolworth daughters, she would be the sole one to emerge more or less intact. Edna arrived next, born in 1883. She was quieter than her sisters, more introverted, and more vulnerable. In 1907, she married Franklin Law Hutton, a young financier connected to the brokerage firm that would later carry his family name. Frank Woolworth harbored reservations about the union. Hutton possessed charm and ambition, yet whispers already circulated regarding his faithfulness. The reservations were overruled. And the wedding proceeded. Jessie, the youngest, born in 1886, presented a different challenge. She fell in love with James Paul Donahue, a handsome Irish-American whose family fortune derived from a fat rendering factory on Manhattan's West Side. The source of the wealth appalled Frank Woolworth. He implored Jessie not to marry him. She married him regardless. Frank forgave her within months, as he always did with his daughters, and added a townhouse to the collection. Frank compensated for his absence through extravagance. Every purchasing trip to Europe produced armloads of gifts for the girls, dolls from Paris, silks from Venice, music boxes from Vienna. As the daughters matured, the presents became more elaborate, yet the time together did not increase. Jenny managed the household alone. Frank came home less frequently as the empire expanded, and when he did, conversations grew briefer. By 1916, Jenny was no longer capable of managing anything. Yet the family's crisis was not approaching from her direction. Edna's marriage had been deteriorating for years. Franklin Hutton drank heavily and maintained mistresses with minimal effort at concealment. Edna, isolated and increasingly despairing, had sought assistance from her father, but Frank was consumed by Winfield Hall's construction, his new Long Island estate, and by business demands leaving room for little else. He attempted intervention once, reportedly confronting Hutton, yet the confrontation altered nothing. Hutton continued as before. On the evening of May 2, 1917, Edna was at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. The details of what occurred in her room have never been fully established. The official cause of death was suffocation resulting from mastoiditis, an infection of the bone behind the ear. No autopsy was conducted. The coroner signed the certificate without one. Yet the rumors commenced almost immediately. Sources close to the family indicated Edna had received correspondence confirming another mistress's existence. According to these accounts, she donned her finest lace dress, positioned herself by her suite window, and swallowed a lethal quantity of strychnine crystals. She was 33 years old. Her daughter Barbara, 4 years old, was the one who discovered her. The child was led away by staff. Franklin Hutton was not present. Frank Woolworth was at Winfield Hall hosting a gathering. When the call arrived, the event concluded that same night. According to a narrative repeated by multiple household members, a crack appeared in the marble family crest mounted above the fireplace in Winfield Hall's main hall. The crest bore carved representations of all 3 Woolworth daughters. The crack ran directly through Edna's face, leaving Helena and Jessie untouched. Frank never recovered from it. He had constructed an empire upon the principle that every problem possessed a solution if you controlled sufficient variables. His daughter's death was the one variable he could not control and the single failure no amount of money could reverse. He interred Edna in the family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Then he returned to Winfield Hall, where the marble crack remained above the fireplace and where the corridors were beginning to feel less like a palace and more like something else entirely. Chapter 7. Emperor Napoleon of Glen Cove. The first Winfield burned in 1916. Nobody ever determined the cause. Frank Woolworth had acquired the property 2 years earlier, a 16-acre estate on the bluffs of Glen Cove overlooking Long Island Sound. The original house was spacious, comfortable, and not remotely adequate for a man who had just completed the tallest structure on Earth. He had already commissioned architect Charles Pierpont Henry Gilbert to prepare replacement plans. When the fire reduced the old house to its foundations, the new plans were ready for implementation. The timing struck many as convenient. It struck some as suspicious. What rose in its place was not a house in any conventional sense. It was a monument. Gilbert designed a 56-room Italian Renaissance residence clad entirely in marble, based on the theory that marble would not burn. Construction cost $9 million. The grand staircase alone, carved from pink and beige marble and rising through the entrance hall's center, accounted for $2 million of that figure. Ceilings were trimmed in 24-karat gold. Floors were exotic hardwood. 16 fireplaces warmed the 12 bedrooms, and a network of tunnels and hidden passageways connected rooms lacking obvious reason for connection. The house contained a ballroom, a billiard room, a solarium, a formal dining room, a music room fitted with an Aeolian pipe organ so powerful it could be heard from half a mile away, and a library. The library is where matters begin growing peculiar. Shelves held works on ancient Egyptian religion, ceremonial magic, and occult sciences that had fascinated European aristocracy since Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Woolworth, who by this point had progressed beyond admiration into something approaching identification, adopted Egyptian motifs for his own home. Scarabs, serpents, and cartouches appeared in carved stonework throughout the house. Winged figures bearing the Egyptian sun god's face decorated upper walls, and woven among all of it, recurring and unmistakable, were carvings of Woolworth's own mustachioed face staring down from ceilings. His granddaughter Barbara, who spent time in the house as a child, would later call it the House of Horrors. The second floor was arranged as a sequence of period rooms, each decorated in a different historical style. There was a Ming Dynasty room, an Elizabethan room, a Louis XIV room, a Marie Antoinette room, and at the corridor's heart, the room explaining everything else. A precise replica of Napoleon Bonaparte's bedroom at the Château de Malmaison. Woolworth had scoured auction houses and private collections across Europe to furnish it. The bed featured a canopy of 14-karat gold leaf and had reportedly once belonged to the emperor himself. The bath was pink marble. The furniture was Empire-style, heavy and symmetrical, arranged exactly as it appeared in contemporary Malmaison illustrations. This was not a collector's tribute. Woolworth did not display these items behind glass or treat them as historical curiosities. He used them. He wore the uniforms. He sat in what he called the emperor's chair. According to those employed in the house, he He spent hours alone in the Malmaison room with the door closed, surrounded by possessions of a man deceased for nearly a century. Adjacent to Woolworth's suite was the Empress Josephine room. It was decorated in the style of Napoleon's first wife and connected to Woolworth's bedroom by a passage the household referred to with characteristic understatement as the private corridor. The room was not occupied by Jenny Woolworth. According to multiple accounts, it was occupied by Woolworth's mistress. Jenny's own bedroom at the house's opposite end was bare by comparison. No gilding, no historical motif, no passage to anyone. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not accidental. The estate entrance was framed by a stone archway modeled on the Arc de Triomphe. The driveway, lined with life-sized Grecian statues, led visitors past formal gardens maintained by a staff of 70. The house itself required an additional servant crew estimated at 75 to keep it functioning. Woolworth presided over all of it with the conviction that he was not merely imitating Napoleon but continuing his work. Several individuals close to him reported that he believed himself to be the emperor reincarnated, a claim he appears to have made without irony. Whether this represented genuine delusion, theatrical eccentricity, or something intermediate, the house made it physical. Every surface, every room, every hidden passage expressed the interior world of a man who had grown up on a failing upstate New York farm and now inhabited an imperial fantasy constructed from nickels and dimes. The organ played at night. The golden ceilings reflected candlelight. The carved face of the owner watched from above, and somewhere at the house's far end, behind a door that rarely opened, Jenny sat alone and recognized nothing. Chapter 8. The Unsigned Will. In 1916, around the time Jenny's condition became impossible to ignore, Frank Woolworth promoted a young man named Hubert Templeton Parson to general manager of the F.W. Woolworth Company. Parson had joined the firm as a bookkeeper in 1892 when barely out of his 20s and had risen through ranks by being efficient, loyal, and perpetually available. Frank treated him like the son he never had. He trusted Parson with operational decisions, confided business strategy to him, and positioned him closer to the company's center than any founding syndicate member. Then Parson began to compete. He constructed a Fifth Avenue mansion that was by several accounts larger than Woolworth's own. He purchased a country estate in Long Branch, New Jersey, called Shadow Lawn, which was grander than Winfield Hall. When Woolworth acquired a new automobile, Parson acquired a newer one, complete with uniformed chauffeur. The mimicry was so persistent and so deliberate that people throughout the Woolworth organization began discussing it openly. Whether Parson was driven by ambition, insecurity, or genuine belief he had outgrown his patron, the effect on Frank was corrosive. The man who had controlled every empire detail for 40 years now had a subordinate appearing to rehearse for the successor role. Frank did not dismiss him. He did not confront him. He withdrew. After Edna's death in May 1917, something in Frank's constitution broke. He began experiencing violent mood swings, alternating between frantic energy periods and weeks of near-total collapse. He would appear at the Woolworth building in the morning and be unable to leave his office by noon. He would retreat to Winfield Hall and remain in his Napoleonic bedroom for days at a time, seeing no one. Staff learned to read the signs and stay clear when the door was closed. His physical health deteriorated correspondingly. He had suffered digestive problems for years, and a bout of what may have been typhoid in the late 1880s had left him with a constitution never fully recovering. Yet the most dangerous weakness was the one he refused to address. Frank Woolworth was terrified of dentists. The fear was lifelong, irrational, and absolute. He would not submit to examination. He would not permit instruments near his mouth. By 1918, several teeth had decayed badly, and at least one had become severely infected. His physicians urged treatment. He refused. On April 5, 1919, 3 days after leaving his Woolworth building desk for what would prove the final time, the infection reached his bloodstream. Sepsis set in quickly. Frank Woolworth died at Winfield Hall on April 8, 5 days before his 67th birthday. His rival Sebastian Kresge, head of the competing Kresge chain, closed every one of his own stores on the funeral day to honor the man he called the Master of the 5 and 10. The mourning did not last long before lawyers arrived. Frank Woolworth had been preparing a new will for some time. The document was drafted, reviewed, and ready for signature. It was designed to distribute his wealth among surviving daughters and their families with provisions for continued company management and for Jenny's care, whose condition had by then been stable in its deterioration for years. He had not signed it. Whether the delay was procrastination, superstition, or simply distraction of a mind increasingly elsewhere, the result was devastating. Without a valid new will, courts fell back on the most recent signed document, a will drawn up in 1889 when Frank Woolworth was a struggling retailer with a handful of stores and modest income. That will contained a single provision. Everything went to his beloved wife, Jenny. Jenny, who could no longer recognize her own daughters. The estate was valued at approximately $76 million. It included personal holdings, real estate, and company shares now stretching across 2 continents. All of it passed to a woman sitting in a room she did not understand under the care of a committee appointed to manage her affairs. Frank's daughters Helena and Jessie were named to the committee along with his trusted associate Hubert Parson, the men who had spent the previous 3 years trying to outshine him. Jenny Woolworth lived another 5 years. She died on May 21, 1924, at age 71. Under administration terms, the estate, which had grown to roughly $78 million, was divided into 3 equal portions. 1/3 went to Helena McCann, 1/3 went to Jessie Donahue, and 1/3 went to the sole child of Edna Woolworth Hutton, a girl named Barbara, who was 11 years old and had already lost both people who might have protected her from what the money would do. Chapter 9. Poor Little Rich Girl. $26 million arrived in Barbara Hutton's life before she had any comprehension of what to do with it. She was 11 years old when grandmother Jenny died and the Woolworth fortune was carved into thirds. Her share, held in trust, made her one of the wealthiest children on the planet. It did not make her any less solitary. After her mother's Plaza death, Barbara had been passed between relatives like an unwanted heirloom. Her father Franklin Hutton moved her to San Francisco, then back to New York, then to boarding schools in Connecticut and Manhattan. He was, by most accounts, an indifferent parent, yet a gifted investor. And he managed Barbara's trust with sufficient skill that when the Wall Street crash of 1929 eliminated much Woolworth family wealth, Barbara's portion actually increased. She entered adulthood richer than her grandfather had been at his power's peak. The public encountered her in 1930 when her family staged a debutante ball at the Ritz-Carlton, reportedly costing more than $60,000. It was the Great Depression's depths. Bread lines stretched through lower Manhattan, and newspapers were not kind. Headlines christened her the poor little rich girl, a name following her for the rest of her life and one she would never manage to escape. She married for the first time at 20. His name was Alexis Mdivani, a self-styled Georgian prince whose royal credentials were